looking ahead, we have got the World Series resuming this weekend, the PDC's annual trip down under, events in Australia and New Zealand. But of the 8 PDC representatives, who is this trip the most important for?
Yeah, I think there's an obvious answer. We kind of have both alluded to it earlier, but Peter Wright, who's really been struggling as of late. But it's just no way that I see him playing well. But then again, every time we think he's finished, he pulls something out of the bag, including last year at the European Championships. And maybe that's going to happen again. But I just don't see it. Peter Wright just seems to be completely gone. And it seems like these will very likely be his last World Series events unless something unexpected happens to turn his game around. So while it's the biggest for him in that regard, I'm not going to go with him as the answer. I'm going to go with the only PDC representative who is also an Oceanic player, and that's Damon Hedda. It's been a bizarre year, I'll say, for Damon. I mean, he's 9th in averages so far this year, and he's had some absolutely electric performances, not least of the one being the one against Luke Littler in Minehead in the UK Open, where he threw out the table topper in the Premier League and the reigning World Championship finalist in one of the matches of the year. But there's also been a lot of times where, especially on the big stage, he has not been up to snuff. And that is concerning because he seems so close to that big breakthrough. And yet at the same time, he also has never seemed further away at times. And going back home, as well as going to New Zealand, and to be the player that is not just there as the Oceanic representative, but as one of the 8 PDC representatives, is a huge opportunity for him. But it's also a huge chore for him. And I want to see how he handles it. He is one of the 10 best players in the world, in my opinion. At the very least, one of the 12 best. And he is a player who should be in the talk to make the Premier League because he's good enough and he's entertaining enough. And yeah, he likes to give the English crowd, at least, all the hell in the world. But everywhere else, he is a fan favorite. And even, I think, English crowds like him, even if he is taunting the English national team, the English cricket team at the Ashes every other year. But this is huge for him because he is one of those PDC representatives, and he's not had the big stage results, that Luke Littler match aside, that match his quality and his level of performances so far this year, especially on the floor. I want to see what Damon Hedda we get. He's so close to making a major final. He's so close to maybe lifting a major trophy, World Cup aside, but he's also so far, and he needs to show that he deserves to be one of the PDC representatives when it all counts in this tournament. So it's big for him. He's good enough for it. It's time, though, that he takes that step.
Yeah, I think there's a few possible answers here, and I like that shout with Damon Hedda. But for me, you mentioned him, the obvious one has got to be Peter Wright. And I saw Peter very briefly when I went to the Pro Tour last week. I just arrived at the venue. We were stuck in traffic, so we didn't get there until around 1:45, 2 o'clock. So the first round, it was almost halfway through, but we were getting a drink at the bar, and Peter walks through. He was one of the first players we saw, actually, and it was nice that he recognised me. I've not seen him in person for a while, and I'd seen that he'd won his first game and said, "Well done, good start to the day." And he joked saying, "I've won a game," like being in shock that he'd not lost it in the first round. And obviously that's Peter having a laugh at himself, but it does show you at the same time how far he's fallen, doesn't it? Because for me, it's kind of come full circle in a way, because I remember when I interviewed Peter for a feature for his local paper, this is going back nearly 10 years ago now, but we spoke about his career up to that point. And when he first went on to the Pro Tour in 2008, he earned £1,200 during the whole season, and he said that he'd lose games 6-5, but when he did win a first round game, he'd come off the board in tears because he'd won and he'd earned some money and he could afford to enter the next few events. And okay, Peter's earned quite a lot of money in darts since then. These Players Championship events, it's not the be all and end all for him now. It's not as drastic as it was back then. You're not going to see him in tears now if he wins a first round game in Milton Keynes or Wigan. But as someone who's followed his career for a long time, I do wonder if we're now coming into the final chapters of it, because I've got no inside knowledge or anything, but if Peter's current form continues, how much longer is he going to play for? Because we know he's going to be in all the ranking events, the majors, for a fair while longer, the rest of this year, next year. But beyond that, if he was to slip out of the top 16, then the top 32, does he come back from that? And I don't know the answer to that. But going back to this question, out of the 8 PDC representatives, who are these 2 events coming up down under the most important for? You could argue for Peter Wright, it might be his last time playing in the World Series events in New Zealand and Australia. The other 7 is going to be a first time for the 2 Lukes, Littler and Humphreys going there. But the other 5, you'd expect to see them get a few more invites and be in that lineup for a lot more years to come. So they're all going to be going there to enjoy the trip, and I've never been, but from what I've heard, this Australia-New Zealand leg of the World Series is a special one for the players, and it's an experience they don't forget travelling to that part of the world. But at the same time, they want to perform, like you mentioned with Damon Heta. They want to get some results behind them to take into the Pro Tour and the big events coming up at the end of the year. But for me, out of the 8, I've got to go with Peter Wright. I think if he were to win one of these titles or make a final, you'd probably see the most emotion from him, and it would mean the most to him as well, given his current struggles on the hockey.